Well, hi, and welcome to Cybersecurity Workshops. This is David Raymond. I'm the director of the Virginia Cyber Range. And so for this workshop, we are going to continue the Introduction to Command Line Interface course created by Matthew Vogel at Tidewater Community College. And we'll be starting module number 2. Module number 2 is working with files and directories, and we'll start off with the first lesson, which is understanding the basics of the Linux file system. So for instructors, let me quickly go to the courseware repository. I'll show you where to find this course in this lesson. So if I do a search for command space line, I'll find a course called Introduction to the Command Line. Click on the course. I see that there eventually will be a total of 10 modules in this course. Right now there's only 3. We're on the second module, working with files and directories. So I recorded the discussions of the first 2 lessons, which are part of module 1. And those are available on our Cyber Range YouTube channel. In this module, there are several lessons, and we're at the very first lesson, the Linux file system. So in this lesson, there's a lesson plan, there's presentation slides, which I'm going to use for the remainder of this session, and then there's a hands-on lab exercise that I encourage you have your students work on. So back to the slides. Here we go with the Linux file system. Some lesson objectives: we're going to understand the basics of the file system, understand the different types of Linux files. Most importantly, we want to know how to move around the file system, and that's from the command line. So, you know, there is an interface that looks similar to the Windows Explorer in Linux, at least in most Linux desktop environments. And I'll show you that real quickly just to give you another view of the file system. But we're really interested in moving around the file system from the command line. That's what this course is all about. And then we'll talk about finding your location in the file system from the command line. So the Linux file system is this hierarchical tree structure, and it starts with a root directory that's represented by the / character. So at the very base of the file system is this this root. And then in the root directory, there are a bunch of other directories, and some of those are listed here. This is not an all-inclusive list, and it's possible that some systems will have some of these and others won't. It just really depends on the Linux distribution, and it depends on any changes that anybody has made to the file system. Of course, this thing can all be modified by users. And then most of these directories that are right under the root have subdirectories. So an example of that is here we have the home directory, and inside the home directory are the user directories of the various users for the system. And so here we have this example where we have Matt and Bill. They're both users of this particular system, so they each have a directory in the home directory. And then on our Kali Linux system, our username is student. That's how we log in, right? So there's a directory called student, and we'll take a look at that in just a minute. So let me jump on over to my system here, and first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up File Explorer, and so this looks kind of like the Windows File Explorer. I probably won't bring this up very often, but I just want to show it to you right now. And over on the left-hand side here, one of the devices that I can go to is the file system. So if I go to the file system, this takes me to the root of the file system. And so I see these directories like bin and boot and dev and etc and home, and those are similar to what I see on my on this little picture here, right? So this is up in the top, up in the little location bar, I see that I'm in the root of the file system. And then if I go into the home directory, so if I double click on home, then I get /home/ and then the subdirectories in home are EC2 user, student, and Vacker. Okay, so now let's jump into the command line. I'll zoom in here a couple of times So now I'm gonna take a look at that, and the commands I'm going to use we're going to see a little bit later in this discussion, but I just want to show you what this looks like. So I'm going to say cd, I'm going to change directory, and I'm going to go all the way to the root of the file system. So I do that, and so now I'm in the root of the file system, and if I list the contents, I see something very similar to what I saw in the File Explorer a minute ago. I have the various directories, which are shown here in this sort of purpley color. So there's bin and boot and dev and Etsy and home. And then there are some files, and the files are in a slightly different color. And the colorization depends on what kind of a file it is. So if it's a directory, it's a certain color. If it's a text file, it might be a different color. If it's an executable program, it might be a different color. And that's all just done by the terminal to make it sort of easier to sort things out. Okay, so the file system starts at the root, and then it's a tree structure underneath that, and each one of these again are likely to have different subdirectories, and you could imagine this pretty complicated. It is very complicated. So if you were to draw this all out, there could be hundreds of subdirectories. So when you think of this structure, every directory under the root directory has a parent. The root directory is the parent directory for all the directories under root. The home directory is the parent for all the home directories. Okay, so what they're saying here is that there's this child-parent relationship, right? So the parent directory for all of these first-level directories is root, and the parent directory for these user directories is home. So you just think of the parent is the next level up in the directory structure. Common Linux directories, some of these are relevant, some of them really aren't. I'll just go through this very quickly because at this point in your investigation of the Linux file system, this isn't super important, but it is helpful to understand that each of these different kinds of directories are there for a specific reason. The /bin directory holds these are executable programs. These are like utilities, system utilities, programs that are resident in most Linux systems. Most Linux distributions are going to have a bin with this the standard utility executable programs that are used by users and the root user. Boot/boot holds system startup files. So boot is when a computer first starts up. Sometimes that's referred to as booting up or bootstrapping. And so the /boot folder holds system startup files. There's often a /CD-ROM. That is when there's a CD or DVD inserted into the system. That's where the files on that device are going to show up. There's /dev holds device files that represent hardware on the system. Etsy, etc. You'll usually hear that referred to as Etsy. This holds system configuration files. So if you think of a Windows system, the configuration of the various components of Windows and the different programs in Windows is usually done using a thing called the registry. So you have these registry keys that hold configuration data. On a Linux system, you don't have a registry. Instead, you have, for the most part, the configuration data is held in a variety of different files inside this Etsy folder, which is in the root directory. Home, we already mentioned, holds home directories for system users. lib64 holds stuff related to 64-bit programs. Sometimes you'll see a lost and found folder. It is sort of what it sounds like. Lib holds library files for programs, and that may not be super meaningful right now, but it's when you're compiling an executable program, for example, there are these library files that are needed as part of that process, and so at some point we may talk a little bit more about that. I'm going to skip over some of these because again, not super relevant right now. The /root directory is the home directory for the root user. So most users are under home and then student, for example. But root doesn't have a home directory there. Root has its own home directory that is right off the root of the file system. Okay, and then a few more of these. /sbin are system files. /temp holds temporary files. So sometimes when you're creating files, or when the system needs to create a file that it doesn't have to hold on to for a long time, it'll put it in this /temp folder. And generally this stuff in /temp is safe to delete at any time. It's kind of like your trash bin on your Windows system. You know, you drag stuff into the recycle bin. It used to be a trash. Now it's recycling because we're more ecologically aware. But the temp folder in the Linux file system is kind of like the recycle bin on a Windows system. It's stuff that's safe for deletion. Okay, now I've already mentioned a couple times this notion of the root of the file system. So the base of the file system is represented by the / character, and all the other directories are somehow, have those as the, that's sort of the grandparent of all directories. Here we say, do not get the root directory confused with the root user, right? So root is kind of an overloaded term here. The root directory is the root of the file system. The root user is the user who has complete administrative control over the entire file system. So that's different from a standard user, like the student account that you have when you log into to your CyberRange virtual machine. As a student, you can do certain things in the file system. Generally, you can do things that are safe, right? You can't really break the file system. If you're the root user, you can do things that will cause the system to not function anymore. You can delete files in the boot menu, for example, or in the boot directory. And if you delete the wrong stuff in there, then that computer is not going to boot up anymore. The point is the root has complete control over the file system and can do just about anything. And sometimes the things that root can do can get you into trouble, right? So that's why you generally don't function as the root user. And then there's also a directory named root, right? So we have the root of the file system, we have the root user, and then we have this directory called root, and that's where the home directory for the root user is. So root is a bit of an overloaded term, and it's helpful to sort of get straight in your head the different uses of that particular term. Okay, there are different kinds of files in a Linux system, and you'll see these you'll see these symbols when you're looking at directory listings, right? So when you're looking at the directory listing, and we'll see in a minute where we see this symbol, but a regular file is represented with a dash, a directory is represented with a D, a link is indicated with an L. The block device you're not going to see very often. The character file you won't see very often. Sometimes you'll see this named pipe. Sometimes you'll see a socket. Mostly what you're going to see when you do a directory listing is a regular file and a directory, and then maybe a little bit less often than those, then you'll see a link. The rest of these you'll see only under very specific circumstances. And where do you see that symbol? Where? Well, when you list the contents of the so when you type the ls command, this is going to list files on a Linux system. And if I type ls alone on a line like this and just hit enter, that's going to list the contents of the current directory, right? So it's going to list the contents of the directory that I'm in. What does it mean to be in a directory? Well, we'll get to that in a minute, but just suffice it to say that if I type ls, I'm gonna get output to this terminal window the list of files that are in the directory that I'm in, and we call that the current directory or the working directory. And now, if I do this thing called a long list, whoops, didn't mean to cross that out. The long list. So here I do the ls command, and I give it the -L option. So here it is right here. I say ls, and instead of just hitting enter, if I would just hit enter, I would get this thing here. If I do ls and then a -L, it gives me a long list. And what that does is it gives me more information about the files. And at the very beginning here, these are those symbols. So if I go back to my symbol list of the file types, a dash is a regular file, a D is a directory, and then sometimes you'll see these other symbols for different types of files. That's what these are right here at the very beginning. These are the permissions on the file. We'll talk about permissions more later, but the very first column are the type of file, and in this case, they're either regular files or they're directories. So there's file and file one, and that's important because if I'm going to so that tells me that the ones with the D at the beginning, these are directories. So these are subfolders or subdirectories under the current directory. So the current directory would be the parent of all these subdirectories. And here's the list of directories. And in here, this particular terminal helps us out a little bit by showing these as being in a different color. And then there's this file command, and this tells me when I do this, I get an indication of all the files and what kind of a file they are. And a regular file, that doesn't mean a whole lot. So there are different kinds of regular files. The file command will tell me for each specific file what it is. So if it's a directory, it'll tell me it's a directory. If it's a regular file, it'll tell me what kind of a regular file it is. So in this case, the user typed file and then the name of a text file, and I get file one is ASCII text. Okay, and then they did file desktop. So what kind of a file is desktop? And it says desktop is a directory. So the file command can be very helpful if you're trying to figure out what kind of a file something is. Okay, then there's this, I mentioned there's this notion of being somewhere in the file system, and the way to figure out where I am in the file system is with this command pwd, and that is short for print working directory, pwd, print working directory. So it's an easy way to remember it, print working directory. And there it is right there, print working directory. Is used to print the current working directory to the CLI. This allows you to see exactly where you are in the file system. Locations listed with pwd command are always start with the root directory of the file system, which is the slash. So /home/student means the student directory, and the home directory is in the root directory. Okay, so let me show off a little bit of that. Okay, so when I did this cd space slash, what that did was that changed my directory to the root of the file system. And then I did an ls, and I got this listing of files. And if I do an ls-l, you remember I get the long listing. And so here, when I do that, I see, make this a little bit wider so it looks a little bit better. So in this case, I do the ls-l, and if I move this up a little bit, I'll move it up to the top. Okay, there's my ls-l, and so here's the files, right? There's a bunch of D's, directories, right? Bin, boot, dev, etc, home, lib, lib32, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's some L's here, right? L. So those, remember from our symbol table on the slide, L means a link, so it's a symbolic link. So this file called initrd.img is actually a link or a pointer to a file that is this particular file, boot/initrd.img, yada yada yada. So it's a link to another file. So ls-l gives me that long listing. And then if I do pwd, so what does that stand for? Print working directory, pwd. What is it going to tell me? Well, it tells me I'm in the root, so it gives me my slash. And that's where I am right now in the file system. So pwd tells me that. I'm looking for the CD. There's no CD here. I guess we'll get to that. There's this notion of an absolute path. So any directory location, so wherever I'm on the file system, that's called the path to where I am. And so when I think of a path, I'll go way up to my picture here. the notion of a path is, so I might be in home mat docs. So, and the path to home mat docs is from root to home to mat to docs. So that's the path. There's always got to be a, there's got to be a direct path. You can't jump from docs to bill. That just wouldn't work, right? That path would be invalid. But that's where this term path comes from. And the path always starts with the slash, which is the root of the file system. And that when you give that entire path, that's called an absolute path. So for some examples here, /home /student /root /etc /network, those are all paths. There's also a relative path. So a relative path does not start with the root. It starts with wherever I am. Like if I happen to be in home, then inside home there could be a relative path to student /downloads. That's relative to where I am, right? So if I was sitting at the prompt here and there's the blinky cursor, and I could change directory into student /downloads as long as the student directory is in the current directory that I'm in. So that's a relative path, and that means it's relative to where I am right now. Here's our cd command. CD, this is very, very important. This is how I move around from one location to the other in the file system. CD stands for change directory, used to move between directories in the file system. So you can use the absolute path or the relative path to specify a change of location with the CD command. And you can, and kind of the understood way to think about this is you can never go wrong by using the absolute path. So if you know where you are now and where you're going, you can use the absolute path. So you can say / and then give the entire path up to where you want to go. And that's always going to get you where you want to go. A relative path is often much shorter than the absolute path. So it's often much less typing to go in to where I need to be using a relative path. So like if I'm in the /home /student directory and I want to go into the downloads folder from there, I could say cd /downloads. But I could always say cd /home /student /downloads, and that would get me there too. It just requires more typing. The current location is part of the command line prompt. Yeah, so I'll go back to the current location. So let me mention this. The current location is part of the command line prompt. So this is the command line prompt. We talked about this. We talked about this on the very first introduction of Bash, right? So this whole thing here is the command line prompt. Oh, my pen keeps doing weird stuff. This is the command line prompt. Everything from the very beginning of the line up to the $, and then I have my cursor blinking up here. And the current directory is reflected here. So the current directory shows up right after the colon. And you look at that and you say, what's so this is saying tilde. This is called a tilde, this funky symbol. It's usually in the very upper left-hand corner of your keyboard. This is the current directory from the colon up to the $. And you might say, what the heck is a tilde? That's not a path. It turns out, and we'll go to the next slide here. Oh, it's not on the next slide. Wow. Oh yeah, it's right here. The tilde character indicates the current location is the current user's home directory. So the tilde is sort of shorthand for saying my home directory. And again, my home directory, if I'm a student, is /home /student. All right, might sound confusing. We're going to try to put it all together here. So again, here I'm in the root of the file system, and I can do an ls and I can see a whole bunch of files in there, and most of these are directories, right? So I could say, so let's say I want to go to my home directory. I'm student, I want to go to /home /student. Two ways to do this. I can say cd /home, and I'm using tab completion here, /home /st tab /student, cd home student, and boom, there I am. Now I have the tilde right after the colon. Why do I have a tilde? Because that's shorthand for my home directory. So if I say pwd, print working directory, I see I'm in /home/student. So let me use the relative path system. Well, I'm going to use an absolute path to go back to the root of the file system. So I'm going to say cd/, and now print working directory. I'm back in the root. I can use I can use relative paths to get back to students. So I can say cd home. I can say print working directory, and I'm in home, right? And this home shows up between the colon and the $sign. That's where I'm in home. So again, I can use, from here, I can either use an absolute path, so I can cd home student, or since the student folder, so if I do an ls here, the student folder is right here in the home directory, I can use a relative path, so I can just say cd student. Notice when I do this, I don't put the slash at the beginning, because the slash is going to indicate the root of the file system, and I'm not trying to go to, and /student isn't in the root, it's in the home directory. So if I say if I say cd space student, that's a relative path that's going to bring me into my home directory. If I say pwd, that's where I am. If I do an ls-al, well, ls-l, I get a bunch of stuff in there. This is in my home directory, pwd home student. So again, in here, there's a bunch of folders. There's desktop, documents, downloads. There's a couple of files, file 1, file 2. I created these in a previous one of these workshops. And then there's some other directories, folders, directories, whatever you want to call them. D directory. Now, I mentioned, and we see that file 1 and file 2, if you look at the far left here, those are regular files, so there's a dash in front of them. But again, regular file isn't super meaningful. So what I could do is I could use the file command that we saw in an earlier slide. So I could say file, and then file 1. And the file command is going to tell me that file 1 is ASCII text. If I was to say file, and then documents, it tells me that documents is a directory, right? So that's the file command. Okay, so that is moving around directories in the Linux file system. And again, right now I'm in a particular place in the file system. I'm in home student. I could cd into downloads, and now I'm in downloads, and I could list what's in there. All right, back to the slides. So that's the cd command, change directory. You can also use an absolute path to change directories, mentioned that already. Okay, so now we're at the lab. So I would encourage students to go from here to work on the lab that goes along with this lesson on an introduction to the Linux file system. And of course, teachers, it's up to you to get that lab out of the courseware repository and provide that to your students. So thanks, and next time we will delve deeper into Linux files and the file system.